Okay. That should do it. Being live streamed. Got it. Okay. So I am getting started, and whoever else is going to join, or not, as the case may be. All right. So we left off last time. The boys' names had been changed, and it wasn't 100% clear why. We had talked about that they were going to be taught this new language and everything for 3 years, that in order that they could put their minds just to their learning, that the king had arranged that they should have food, that they should have servants, that they shouldn't have anything that was going to distract them from their learning. And there's that beautiful piece of Chassidus about that they were without movement, that they were without gava. And in fact, we continue to hear this idea as the psukim continue. Let's see if I find this and go back up a little bit so that I can see what I'm doing. All right. So what had happened was that the Sarasarisim had given them names. And then we're going to hear also about this business if they were being sent this food, that they didn't want to eat the food. So what exactly is going on with this story? And there are a whole lot of different levels that we can understand this. First of all, there are some people who say that all that they did was translate their names, that the name Daniel means God judges me, or God is my judge. And that the name Belshazzar is basically a translation of that. That's the first reason that Rav Saadia Gaon brings, and that's also the reason that the Ibn Ezra brings, and that's also the reason the Metzudat David brings.
I have a question.
Rash, go ahead.
So Daniel, you're saying, is like din of El, God's law, God's.
No, exactly. Dani, HaKadosh Baruch Hu Dan Oti. He judges me. And so I do everything according to God's judgment. So that in some sense, maybe that Daniel is from the side of Gevura. And we're going to actually hear this from the Ramat Valley on part of what's going on. Yes. And the name, for instance, the name Hananiah means that he found that God was chonen, right? We asked God to be chonen dat, that God will give us knowledge and understanding, and also to give us chen. And so Hananiah is somebody who has these gifts from God. And exactly what Mishael meant. Excuse me?
Chen meaning charm. Chen meaning what?
So chen can be that, but it's also in our Shmona Esrei, we ask HaKadosh Baruch Hu to grant us. Chonen is like to give a free gift, to freely give.
Oh, right, a free gift.
Right? Not exactly bichinam, but it's a sense of, right? Because we say to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, please give us dat, give us understanding and knowledge. Okay, and so too. So the meanings of the boys' names in Hebrew, that Mishael is actually the toughest one for me to come up with exactly what the meaning of that name was supposed to be. And Azariah is that God helps me, right? Or God is the one who helps. But at any rate, so there's one group of Chachamim who believe that the names that the Sarasarisim gave to them were just translations of the Hebrew names. So it's the same name. There are others, and actually Rav Saadia Gaon brings both opinions and accepts them. Ibn Ezra quotes Rav Saadia Gaon, but then says, but I don't know where the Gaon got it from. Like, okay, that's what he said, but I don't get what I got it from. And so the others, the other main opinion is that these names are based on the Avodah Zorah of the costume. And in fact, there's a verse in chapter 4 that we'll see that lends support to this idea, that rather than it's being a translation. So the whole issue of changing names is fairly common in Torah, throughout Tanakh, politically, etc. Yosef was not called Yosef, he was called Tzafnat Paneach. Now, either Tzafnat Paneach means something or other in Egyptian, or it's a name in Egyptian, who knows, or Tzafnat Paneach means the one who decodes that which is hidden, which is a perfectly fine title. It's a Hebrew title. It's a different Hebrew name for Yosef HaTzadik, which is fitting to the role that he played in Egypt for Paro. We saw that Paro Necho changed Eliakim's name to Yehoiakim. That's with a coup. Yehoiakim. It's almost the same name, but he changed it from the Aleph Lamed to Yud Hey Vav. All right, but it stayed a Hebrew name. There's no attempt to make it be a Loazi name, to make it be a foreign name. Whereas these names, Belshazzar, Shadrach, Meshach, Abednego, don't mean anything in Hebrew. Okay, they're giving them names, assimilation kinds of names. And if you look at the two verses, one starts Vayasem Lehem Sarsarisim, these names, and the next verse starts Vayasem Daniel Alibo. And Daniel placed on his heart. Daniel paid attention to what was going on. And he said, you know, this business of giving us the food, and who knows if this food's been offered up to Avodah Zarah, and giving us these names, this whole thing is an attempt to get us to assimilate, to lose our strong connection to Kadosh Baruch Hu, to lose our connection to Am Yisrael, and that we should be more connected. You know, they want to use us to rule over Am Yisrael, but they don't really want us to feel connected to Am Yisrael. I mean, the same thing is true by Moshe. Moshe gets given a name by Batya, Lebitya Bat Paro. Okay, that's not, according to our tradition, that's not the name that his parents gave him. He has a name Tuvia, he has a name Avigdor, he has other names. But the name Moshe, which is actually the name that we continue to call him, the name Moshe was the name that was not given to him by his parents. It was given to him based on an incident in his life. But Daniel says, this doesn't have anything to do with who I am. And you're trying to put on me this other name, you know, you're like erasing my own identity. And so in the next verse, we hear that Daniel says, I don't want lo yitgael b'pat bag hamelach. So I believe that when we first went over all the verses, and I was asking various questions and stuff, I said, you know, like, it's kind of interesting, this shoresh gimel aleph lamed, we have two totally different meanings, right? One is the shoresh for geula, for redemption, what? That he doesn't want to be redeemed? That's clearly not the meaning of it here. And the other is, mag'il. It's like something which is disgusting and gross and right? It's going to make me tameh. It's going to, and that's what he's saying. Okay, shelo yitga'el. And the Ramat Bali says, you might have thought he could have just said, Vayasem Daniel alibo asher lo yitameh, that he shouldn't become tameh because of eating pat bag hamelach and the yain mishtav, etc. But rather, he uses this language of lo yitga'el, lo yitga'al, because lo yitga'al it does bring to our ears that language of geula. And Daniel says the reason that we actually at this time, Am Yisrael is just in the process of being exiled. He has already been exiled, but the Beit HaMikdash still exists, and the rest of the people have not been exiled. Tzidkiyahu, whose name also got changed. That was not his name originally. And Nebuchadnezzar changed his name to Tzidkiyahu. But there, at least, it was changing it to another Hebrew name. That didn't have the same difficulty that this set of names has. And Daniel is saying to himself, according to the Ramat Vali, what causes us to be exiled from our land is when we cause tumah, when we are matame ourselves based on our behavior, whether it's our sexual behavior or behavior with respect to avodah zarah. If we do things which are matame the land, then the land at a certain point can no longer tolerate it, and we get thrown out. Okay. And I don't want to eat things and to do things that are going to delay or prevent the geula from coming. And so he uses this language of lo yitga'al. Because according to the Ramat Vali, he has both the issue of he doesn't want to become tameh, he doesn't want to become disgusting. This on the one hand, and on the other hand, he doesn't want to delay the geula, which would be a result of becoming tameh. All right. And the verses go on. Okay. So for anybody who's following along in their own text, I'm now looking at verse 9. I'd been looking at 7 and 8, and I'm looking at verse 9 and 10. All right. So he goes, actually still in verse 8, not only does he decide he doesn't want to have that happen, so he goes and vayivakesh misar sarisim asher lo yitga'al. He doesn't go to the Sar Sarisim and say, I didn't grow up with this kind of food, doesn't really taste so good to me, maybe you could give me something else. He doesn't go to the Sar Sarisim and make the offer that he eventually makes to the waiter and say, maybe give me seeds from the table of the king, etc. He goes face to face, and he uses language which all of the Mefarshim actually find very surprising. What is this business of? It's one thing that Sam Ali Bo lo yitga'al, that he took it to heart and convinced his 3 flatmates, okay, that he convinces them that they shouldn't do anything which should make them tameh. But to go to the Sar Sarisim and say, I don't want to eat this food because it's going to make me tameh. I don't want to eat this disgusting food. And he's talking about the food from the table of the king. That's taking his life into his hands. It's not like nowadays where you can insult people and it might prevent you from getting your next promotion. but they're not going to throw you in jail and throw away the key. They're not going to say off with his head because you were, rebelled against your boss. Like, that doesn't happen nowadays. So it's hard for us to really have a real understanding of what it means when you have a despotic king who can, in fact, say off with his head. And that's what happens. So Daniel is taking his life in his hands. And most of the Mefarshim point out, it doesn't seem that he had a need to do that, because this business of being given pat bag hamelech and yain mishtav v'chuli, all of this food is being given to all of the boys in this school. It's not specifically being given to Daniel and his friends in an attempt to make them leave their Yiddishkeit. Okay. I made the parallel to the Cantonistim. The Tsar of Russia, in fact, was attempting to convert the Jews. And so he caused he set quotas for a large number of Jewish boys to be drafted. They were kidnapped into his army. And there was great pressure put on, and they were little boys. They weren't ready to be learning war. They were being taught Christianity. And little boys. And they, would say to them, look, we have all this good food and all this stuff if you'll just join our church. But if not, and then if not, they beat them and they burned them with cigarettes and with cigars or whatever. And they whipped them and they barely fed them. And then they would say, look at your friends who did this, or look at, this Christian boy, look at how healthy and whatever he is. And wouldn't you like to be like that? And they tried so hard. And so many of those Jewish boys who were kidnapped during those years, and they had to serve for 25 years. And they were taken away from their home, many of them before they were bar mitzvah. So how much Yiddishkeit did they know yet? And many of those boys gave up their lives in order not to transgress. And many of the others, even though they refused, but they survived it, and they eventually became, soldiers for the Tsar. And at the end of their 25 years, if they'd survived the whole thing, they were released and given a grant of property and this, that, and the other. And there are all sorts of different stories about the people who survived that. But in a sense, what Ramat Vali tells us is that, and he lived before the time of that Tsar, so he didn't have that as an example, but he tells us that that's what Daniel thought was going on. That Daniel thought that this was an issue of trying to cause them to assimilate and trying to cause them to leave their Yiddishkeit. And so therefore he treated this as what we call Shat Hashmad, a time when there is a decree against the Jewish people in an attempt to cause them to leave Judaism. Now, normally, if it's not something where it's pointed at you as a Jew, you're being asked to do something which is asur, but the person who's asking you doesn't know that it's asur for you and doesn't really care. All right. And he's not doing it because you're Jewish and because he's trying to get you to do something against the Torah. He's doing it for his own reason, whatever it may be. So you do not have an issue of Kiddush Hashem if you're not being singled out because you're Jewish. But if it's an issue of trying to make you assimilate, trying to make you leave your Yiddishkeit, then we say even something as small as changing the color of your shoelaces. Evidently, this was a thing in the Gemara. That Jews wore one color and other nations wore different colors. That even something, as small as a custom, not even like a custom that's based in Jewish law or based on a verse, but just that's how Jews do things, right? That in a time of Shmad, then you're to give up your life for the smallest little thing. And when it's not a time of Shmad, however, then the inyan of Pikuach Nefesh takes over, and in that case, you're only to give up your life in order not to kill somebody else, not to be guilty of adultery, and not to commit avodah zarah. Daniel thought, it turns out he was incorrect, but Daniel thought that the whole point of, and he got the clue because of the way they changed his name. He thought that what was going on was an attempt to convert them away from Yiddishkeit. And so therefore, he felt that even the least little thing was something to make a stand about. And so he goes one-on-one, as it were, with the Sarsarisim, and he says, he requested lo yitka'at, that he should not become tamei, that he should not eat this food from the king or the wine. And actually, the Gemara then explains mishtav, because mishtav is in the plural and not in the singular, that it not only refers to wine, it also refers to oil, the two different kinds of nosely things, of liquid things. All right. And the Gemara actually learns, we have a halacha about not eating pat nachri, not eating bread that was baked by a non-Jew, not drinking wine. So for sure, not yain nesach. Yain nesach is wine that the libation was poured from it for idol worship. That for sure is also. Okay, because that's also from regular laws of avodah zarah. But we're not even supposed to drink stam yena. We're not even supposed to drink, just wine that they make for drinking, not wine that they make for any religious purpose. And originally, the halacha also included not to use oils that were made by non-Jews. In the end, the halacha never included the issue of the oil, because the people couldn't stand by it. And something which is a gezerah, which is what this was, something which is a gezerah, Chazal teach, and we're taught, that you don't make a gezerah that the people can't live up to. So the issue of the wine, although it's implied in this verse, the issue of the oil, even though it's implied in this verse, the issue of the oil never actually made it into halacha l'maaseh. And there are people who will argue about there are people who are more careful about eating pat Yisrael and bishul Yisrael, and there are people who are less careful. There are many people who, even if they're not careful about it, say from Cheshvan until Av, will become that from Elul to Yom Kippur anyway, and for sure between Rosh Hashanah and Yom Kippur, there are people who will become very makpid on that. Here in Israel, it's not such a problem. In Chutz La'aretz, it becomes much more of a problem. And we have all sorts of stories. One of my favorite kids' stories was a story about the Maharal of Prague. But he'd been nice. I'd give you Bekitzer the story, right? He'd been nice to this non-Jewish boy one time who later overheard his evil uncle, it's, almost a fairy tale kind of thing, planning to poison the bread because the Jews, after Pesach, so nobody has any flour until they get to buy the flour back, until they get to actually bake it. It was the custom there to that they did eat the bread from non-Jewish bakeries, right? Which, if you're careful about Pat Yisrael, you wouldn't be doing that, but they did that, and they were planning on poisoning all the Jews. And because Maharal had been kind to this boy, he snuck out and he told Maharal about what it was. And the solution Maharal came up with was to make an announcement in Shul. Oh, we made a mistake in the calendar, and actually Pesach lasts one more day. Right? And so the day that these non-Jews thought was going to happen, they were going to sell all of this bread that they had poisoned to the Jews. There wasn't a single Jew who was interested in buying bread because Maharal had told them that they'd made a mistake, and really this was the 8th day of Pesach. They couldn't eat the bread. Anyway, the story ends very happily. They get caught. He reports it to the local lord. The local lord or king or whoever, brings them in and says, okay, so if there's any truth to this Jew's story, then you'll be happy to eat this bread yourselves, right? They didn't want to. So first he fed some of it to the dogs. The dogs fell over and died. And then he force-fed it to the people who tried to kill the Jews. That was the end of that story. But the point is that there are places and times where Am Yisrael is more careful about this gzeira of Pat, Nachri, and, or Lefa, to only eat Pat Yisrael. And Chazal, when they discuss this halacha, it's a gzeira, it's a takana, it's not from the Torah. It's D'Rabbanan. They say, who was the person who put this gzeira in place? It was Daniel, right here in this chapter. This is where he does it. He says, we're not eating from this patbag, and we're not drinking this yain. Okay, and so it's this story that actually gives us originally that halacha, and the purpose of it is to prevent too much familiarity. If people sit and eat together, that brings a lot of familiarity between people, and it can lead to assimilation. A friend of mine who used to work for, I don't remember, it was the FBI, one of the various kinds of intelligence agencies in the United States, was reminding me about a story that took place about 10 years ago, that there was an agent who happened to be an Orthodox Jew, or at least a Jew who kept kosher. And he got reported to his superiors by two of his colleagues, and they were convinced that he was passing secrets on. So I don't know, maybe it's the CIA rather than FBI, whatever, but that he was passing, that he was a traitor and he was passing information to the bad guys, etc. And what was their reason? Because when they wanted to go out to eat, he wouldn't go out to eat with them. And he would claim, it's not by the way that he was hiding it, and he would stay behind. He wouldn't go out to eat with them. So he was alone with the information, etc. And so clearly he was the one who was doing this bad stuff, whatever it was. It's not clear that there actually was anything bad that was happening. Eventually the Jew was was found innocent, and theoretically he actually lost his job for a while, but eventually they reinstated him. But in the meantime, his reputation was completely destroyed. And the issue was that he didn't go out to eat with them, and they took offense at the fact that he wasn't willing to socialize with them. And that dafka is one of the intentions. I don't think it was God's intention when he gave us the halachot of kashrut, but it's definitely one of the intentions behind what Daniel gave us, which is this issue of to only eat Pat Yisrael and Bishul Yisrael, etc. And it's part of the tension that particularly people in Chutz La'aretz have to deal with. On the one hand, you're living in and amongst non-Jews, and you need to work with them. You need to you need to cooperate with them. And on the other hand, you need to maintain your purity and your connection to God. And so one of Daniel's ways of putting that into place, and he's really one of the very first Jews who's put in this position, right? I mean, the first one we see is Yosef in Mitzrayim, all right? But he doesn't quite have the same problems because the Egyptians were vegetarians. So he doesn't have the problem with Trephus, etc. But that's really our first prototype. But then after that, we don't see Jews in a place where they're not the majority until we get here to Sefer Daniel, and then afterwards to Megillat Esther. But otherwise, and maybe to some extent you see it in Megillat Ruth, okay? Because Nomi and Elimelech and their sons, Machlon and Kilion, voluntarily went into Galut. But B'derech Klal, we don't see it until here. And so Daniel is dealing and setting a pattern that was then used by Am Yisrael through the generations. But at any rate, he originally confronts the Sarasarisim and asks that he not become Tameh. And then it says, and God gave Daniel chesed and rachamim before the Sarasarisim. And the question is asked, how can you understand that? Because immediately the Sarasarisim says to him, no, I can't do what you're asking. So what kind of chesed and rachamim is that? And the answer that most people give is, number one, he spoke to him gently. He didn't get angry at him. He didn't report him to the king as a rebel, right? He spoke gently to him. And perhaps he even, right, he hinted at a solution to Daniel. He says to Daniel, look, I'm afraid of my master, the king, who has appointed your food to you. He's apportioned out your food and your drinks. Okay? That if he's going to see your faces and they'll be zoafim, they'll be darker or coarser or whatever than the children who of your age who are eating, in other words, who are eating from Bag HaMelech and drinking the wine. So then you will have caused me to lose my head to the king, because the king is not going to blame you for it. He's going to blame me for it. And, initially it's possible that what Daniel was asking, see, there are two parts of the problem. Originally, Daniel is asking for kosher food. It shouldn't come from the shulchan of the king. That's a problem because that's a rebellion. On the other hand, if he had asked for, which is remember what he asks, we've already heard the verses. So what he asks the waiter for are zeronim, seeds, nuts, things that don't get cooked. Okay, there's no bishul nachri, there's no pot nachri, there's no stam yenam, there's no issue, and for sure not yain nasach. There's no problem with the food that he asked for, but in the end, what he asks for from the waiter is food that does come from the shulchan of the king. So it's not the food that the king had originally appointed to them, but once he realizes that this is not an attempt to cause him to convert, to cause him to assimilate, to cause an undue degree of closeness, but he realizes that, oh, this is meant to be, the king is trying to make sure that we should be healthy and that we should be, because he wants people who are mareh tov, we should appear nice, that we should have strength, etc. So then I don't have a problem taking it from the shulchan of the king, but I don't want this food which maybe had been offered to Avodah Zarah. I still want to maintain some separation, but it doesn't have to be good food that's prepared not from the shulchan of the king. So there were two issues here. There was the question of merit, and once he realizes that he's not being faced with an attempt to convert him, he drops any attempt at merit at all. And this is also the reason why afterwards he doesn't go back to the Sarasim with his suggestion of, well, try it out on this other thing. All right. Now he can just deal with the waiter, because now he doesn't have to go one-on-one to protect his Yiddishkeit and to say, I'm ready to be Moser Nefesh on it. That he doesn't have to do anymore. Right? Now he just wants to make sure that he's not going to become tameh by eating inappropriate food and drinking inappropriate wine. So that he can do sub rosa, and he does. All right. But he also hears in the words of the Sarasim that there's an issue about that they shouldn't look different from the other youth. So he deals with both things when he goes to the waiter. And he says to the waiter that the Sarasim had appointed, right? The Sarasim says, I can't do this directly. I'll give you a waiter. He's a nice guy. You deal with him. I'm not saying that out loud. I didn't say that. If you ever ask me, I will deny that I ever said any such thing, right? But that's according to, I believe, both Ramad Mali and maybe also the Al-Sheikh and the Malbim for sure, that's when it says that God gave Daniel for Chesed and Rachamim. This is the Chesed and Rachamim that he got. He didn't get a positive answer to what he asked, but he got his own waiter who was told that these are really good kids. He got hints at what's the important thing that's going to cause what your request to be noticed. And he understood from the answer that he got that this is not an issue of trying to force conversion. And so that was the Chesed and Rachamim. And so now Daniel can offer his experiment, right? Try us for 10 days, see whether there's any change, right? Give us water, give us zeronim. Okay? And you'll see whether our expression, whether our faces, our complexion changes or not. All right. And everybody says, And so he listened to them and he tried them. And at the end of the 10 days, he saw that their visage, right, their complexion was good and that they were brie basar. So everybody understands the two things as follows. That marehem tov means that they had nice complexion. They weren't pimply, which is a thing that happens to boys that age. They were, they're, and the Alshich and the Chida. The Chida says that the fact that their visage, their appearance was good, what does that come from? Right? When somebody has a clean complexion, it's clear, obviously, that it can be affected by their diet, but the Chida tells us it's even more affected by their state of mind and the state of their spirit. So he says that it depends on Simchat Halev. And they were very happy because they weren't being asked to eat the food that they weren't supposed to. And what teenage boy particularly objects to having somebody who's waiting on them hand and foot? And these particular teenage boys are, like many of us know, they were kids who were like really, they had sharp minds and they had curious hearts. And they were being offered all the time they wanted to delve into learning. And for them, this was like, it was as close to heaven on earth as they were going to get, given that they were no longer in Yerushalayim. Okay? So, of course, they had Simchat Lev. And so the Alshich says that's not miraculous. What's miraculous is that they were brie basar. So brie basar means evidently that they were full-bodied. Okay? Perhaps. That they weren't rail thin. Okay? Which he says that's actually more difficult to eat enough seeds to keep up your energy and to keep up your body. And so everybody also, the Malbim also says that bari basar means that they were fatter, they were fuller, everybody seems to say sort of the same thing. So, and they all say that was what HaKadosh Baruch Hu gave them. That the fact that they were, and not just that they appeared like the other boys who were eating the patbag of the melech, they actually appeared better. They were stronger, more clear complected, etc. We might not be as surprised today. There are plenty of people today who think that a raw foods diet or a vegetarian or Tivoni vegan diet is good for you and healthy for you. But that probably was not the case several hundred years ago and before that. And it also depends on how much work you're being asked to do. It's very hard on a vegan diet to put in a full day of physical labor. If you're doing things that deplete your proteins and deplete your body, you need to replace that. And while it can be done, it takes an awful lot of seeds and raw grains, etc., to be able to do it. And it's much easier with the fattier foods. And so these boys were being asked to study. Now, Chazal also tell us that it's appropriate. When they talk about like sumptuary laws, almost the Jewish version of sumptuary laws, and they talk about. Let me see. They talk about that people at certain socioeconomic places should get, should eat meat once, or you should eat chicken, right? Or you should eat some kind of poultry and fish on Shabbos, and the rest of the week maybe not. But the Talmidei Chachamim actually are supposed to have it more often than once a week, because to really immerse yourself into Torah and into learning, you need brain food. All right. So it's interesting for people who are committed vegetarians. I'm not trying to convert anybody that they should be eating fish or they should be eating meat, but this is the understanding that Chazal had from these verses here in Daniel. Okay. All right. I think I pretty much went through most of the questions that we had. And so up to this point, so let me take a look, and I've got a little bit of time. So let me see if I can finish out the chapter, and then next week we'll start with the next chapter. All right. So okay. So at the end, anyway, so so what happens is that the trial works, and then the Meltzar, most of the Mefarshim bring it. It's kind of sweet. It says, "No say et pat bagam," not pat bag hamelach. All of a sudden, it's pat bagam. Their pat bag. What does that mean? He would bring it to them. No say et pat bagam, and the yayin mishtehem, and the wine that was appointed for them to drink. He would bring it from the shulchan of the Melech to the boys' room. And he would additionally give them zaronim. And then what else does noseh mean? It means he took it. Okay. So he brought it there, but then he removed it. Okay. He took it away. And so it was a win-win situation for everybody involved. He now had the patban and the wine, and he could sell it or he could feed it to his own family, and all he had to supply in return were these zaronim. And the boys got what they wanted, so which was to not eat the tray food, to not eat the food that would cause them to become tameh. And so these four boys, okay, it now says, after this story of this Mesirut Nefesh, which is sort of the canonical story that has been repeated throughout the generations of our exile. And you still see Mesirut Nefesh, a kid's born into a family, right? The whole business of Heichal Tmurot, right? Kid's born into a family, the family doesn't keep kosher, the child wants to keep kosher. There's a girl that I met through Shiviti, and her husband, when he was telling over sort of part of his story, he had decided as a kid, even before his bar mitzvah, that he wanted to be keeping kosher, and he wanted to be keeping Shabbos, and he wanted to be doing all these things. And his parents were really against it. And he was hiding out in his own family's home, trying to be Mekayim mitzvot. His parents caught him at it, and they were angry with him. And so eventually, Baruch Hashem, it got resolved. But he was Moser Nefesh. Granted, his parents, there wasn't a threat of death over him. But how do you both maintain the mitzvah of Kibud Av V'Em and try to maintain the other mitzvot? So sometimes it's not even an issue of exile. It's just even an issue with you're born into a place that doesn't understand who you are and what you are, and how do you maintain your identity and still know how to get along. And I mean, that's the metach that we have, the tension that we have in the world. Anyway, so the last verses are these 4 boys. God gave them both Madah and Seichel in every Sefer and Chachma. And in addition to that, Daniel understood B'kol Chazon V'chalamot. I wanted to read about this. Let's see if I can find it. Here. Right. So Ramat Valley explains, right, this is Chachma Bin Adat, and that he understood, and so Kadosh Baruch Hu had given them that. That's not actually where I wanted to read the Ramat Valley from. And so at the end of the time, the king said to bring them, and the Sarasarisim brought them before Nebuchadnezzar. The Al-Sheikh says, normally, comes time for graduation, you have a panel of people who ask you questions and try to catch you up. And the Sarasarisim actually acted with wisdom. Here, this is part of that chesed and rachamim that he has for Daniel and his compatriots, is he brought them directly before Nebuchadnezzar himself. Nebuchadnezzar is known to Chazal as a very wise king who had a great desire for truth. And that, in fact, there was one, I don't remember if I shared this with you or not, that one of the reasons why he wanted these to be advisors of his, these boys, to learn the language of the costume, is that he wanted to be able to talk philosophy with them. He wanted to find among them people that he could talk with freely and honestly, and he didn't want there to have to be a translator between them. So he needed them to be able to speak his language so that it would be clear what everything was being said. And he didn't want it being reported back out to the Ovdei Avodah Zarah that he was king over them, because he didn't want to cause problems. And so the Sarasarisim brings them directly before Nebuchadnezzar, not to be tested by everybody else, but to be tested by Nebuchadnezzar alone. That's from the Al-Sheikh. And he spoke with them. The king spoke with them. And again, of course, we have Ha-Melech. And anytime you have Ha-Melech, right? And this verse here where it said, so here he brought them before Nebuchadnezzar. In the next verse, it says, the king spoke with them. And he didn't find among any of the boys anyone who was like Daniel, Hananiah, Mishael, Azariah. V'ya'amdu lifnei hamelech. And they stood then before the king. And it was not Al-Sheikh. Maybe in Ramat Valley, or it may have been the Malbim, says that this phrase Ya'amdu lifnei hamelech is a siman tov. But okay, Ya'amdu lifnei hamelech is in the Ramat Valley, and he says this being stood before the king down below is a siman tov for them, because just as they're standing before the king here on earth, so too they have a position and they're standing before the king Elyon, HaKadosh Baruch Hu. And he brings verses proving it by Yosef, who stood before Paro, also stood before HaKadosh Baruch Hu. David, when Shaul said to him, Ya'amod na David lifanai, ki matza chen b'einai. This is before he lost his mind and got paranoid and started persecuting David. This was a siman tov for David, because from then on he had this emdah also before Melech Elyon, and he found chen in HaKadosh Baruch Hu's eyes. So the Ramat Valley keeps reminding us to read this whole Sefer on more than one level, that there are other things going on. And then, and the Ramad Valley then explains how or why it is that, so the king spoke with them, V'kol devar chachmat bina, asher bikesh mehem hamelech, every matter of chachma, the wisdom of understanding. What's bina? Bina is that you can understand devar mitoch devar, that you can do, I have to know the English for this word, excuse me, inferential reasoning. Deductive, straight deductive reasoning can be taught, but inferential or inductive reasoning is a much more rare quality. And everything that he asked of them, that the king asked of them, he was able to find. And he found them to be 10 Eser Yadot, 10 hands higher than all of the various kinds of soothsayers and magicians and wise men, etc., that were in his entire kingdom. And so he appoints them to be among his advisors. They're still not very old. They don't have a lot of life experience to go with it, but I think, Nebuchadnezzar should only know. But I think that we see from how Daniel first spoke to the Sarasarisim and then spoke to the Meltzar, that Daniel already knows how to maneuver politically. He doesn't have lots of life experience doing it, but he was able to intuit how to do it. And he's given a lot of siyata deshmaya. And of course, we were told that in addition to the book learning kinds of stuff and to philosophy and truth, he's the one who also has the ability for vision and for interpreting dreams, for being able to listen to what's going on behind the scenes. Okay. So that takes us to the end of this chapter. Whoops. That's not what I want. Here. Does anybody have any questions before I turn all of this off? Yeah, Bacha, Ida, questions?
It's very enlightening. It's very enlightening.
So I love the way it's the last part. It says, in every matter of the art of reasoning that the king asked them, he found them 10 times better than all the neocromancers and astrologers that were in his desired kingdom. So it sounds like we have achieved what could be better than that? Why don't we just end right there?
Because now we're going to get stories. So in the beginning,
they told you the result that you're going to hear, like,
well, right. So now they get appointed, but then what happens, right? I don't hear you, but think about it. What happens when somebody is found to be so much better? If everybody is looking out for who's the most appropriate person for the job and is not looking out for number one,
right?
Okay, then that's the end of the story. Am Yisrael is in its position of being Or Lagoyim, and what could be better? But in fact, we're going to see among the stories that there's jealousy, that they have to, that for Jews who are, and it's interesting, here we are, all of us have some connection to Eretz Yisrael, whether we are currently sitting abroad or currently sitting in our homes in Jerusalem. But we all have connection here. We all have spent many years here. And what do we have? We have this and nonetheless, even though we're here in Eretz Yisrael, as a total people, we're seeing so much anti-Semitism in the world right now. We're seeing so much difficulty. So the end of the story hasn't been told yet.
Right.
Yeah. The conditions for a happy end to the story may be in place, but the end of the story hasn't been told yet. And Daniel is going to go through a large number of incidents where he's tested over and over again on the issue of Mesirut Nefesh, on Kiddush Hashem, on the issue of how do you get along. I mean, Yosef also, right? On the one hand, he was trying to save the lives of all those people in Mitzrayim. He was looking to see when those dreams that he himself had had as a youth were going to come true. He's not sure what's going on with his relationship with his birth family. He's out of touch with them for all that long time. But he actually doesn't have the same trouble that Daniel has. Bavel was much more willing to allow the Jews to assimilate. Okay, Mitzrayim was not. Just as I said, Yosef didn't have the problem with the treif meat and this, that, and the other because of the circumstances of how Mitzrayim, based on their religion, etc., how what their diet was like. But in addition, the Mitzrayim had very much of a caste system. I don't know if it's pronounced caste or caste, C-A-S-T-E, where people of one socioeconomic, religious, whatever position didn't eat with people in the other. India has a similar sort of thing going on, or at least did prior to the British. And so the Egyptians wouldn't eat with Yosef. So he didn't have, he had the challenge, obviously, at the beginning of Potiphar's wife wanting to be inappropriately intimate with him, but he was there as a servant. What she had in mind about wanting to get it on with a servant is like, so there are medrash that say that she saw that there was going to come out from her and from Yosef, essentially basically Mashiach ben Yosef, etc. And what she didn't realize is that it wasn't her, it was her adopted daughter, who ends up being Yosef's wife many years later, but who actually turns out to be, right, the daughter of Dinah, according to most midrashim. And so he actually married a Jewish woman, but leaving that aside, that medrash piece aside, there was not the issue of, it's such a welcoming place. In some ways, it's easier for Jews to remain Jews if they're forced off into a ghetto, if they're forced off into a place where they live with other Jews. Okay. If there's a certain degree of anti-Semitism, okay, and you just sort of take it for granted and you circle the wagons and you hold together. It's easier to maintain your Judaism then, and you can do business with the people on the outside, but nobody's expecting there to be this kind of intimacy and the sort of melting pot kind of stuff, or assimilation or whatever. A place like Bavel is much more challenging. A place like the United States is much more challenging than a place where anti-Semitism is acceptable, it's on the face, and Jews sort of necessity stick together. For us as a people, that's much easier to deal with than a place that says, sure, you can be like us. What do we care? Come and join us. But if you try to do things that make yourself separate, well, that's not very nice. And so there becomes much more of a temptation to assimilate, and it's much harder to maintain to maintain your specialness, your yichuda, the yichud of being a yehud. And that's, and that's really the situation that Daniel found himself in. And that's the situation that we find ourselves in as Israelis also. We want to be a nation like all other nations, but we don't really want to be a nation like all other nations. But it's like, I don't like it that other people judge us by a much stricter standard than they judge themselves. But on the other hand, darn tootin', I judge us on a much stricter standard than I judge other nations, because I have higher expectations of what it means to be a nation, right? We just heard in the Parsha that Avram is being entrusted with this mission because God trusts that he's going to teach his children to act with tzedek and mishpat. We expect that of ourselves. I don't like it when others say, you do it and I don't have to, or they put on the face and say, look how I'm like, I don't like that. I think many of us don't like that, but Sefer Daniel opens up a lot of these kinds of questions for us and gives us sort of prototypical stories that get repeated in various different ways. And in some ways, Babel is much more challenging for us than Mitzrayim was. In some ways, Babel was a wonderful place for us. Actually, from the time that Daniel got there until the 1930s, I mean, you're talking 2,500 years, Bavel was a center of Jewish life. The Talmud Bavli, the Jews were able to bring down oral Torah. The Gaonim, Rav Sadia Gaon, whom we have as a parish on Sefer Daniel and other things, but Rav Sadia Gaon or Shir Gaon, the period of the Gaonim, which lasted until the period of the Rishonim, the period of the Gaonim was immense. People like the Ben Ish Chai, which was, or the Orach Chaim, we had geniuses of spirituality and of halacha and of Jewish leadership. Bavel was a place of great fruitfulness for us for many, many, many years. But it's, how do you find the balance and how do you stay in that right balance? That's something that's not, that was not understood from the get-go. And Daniel and his friends, that's part of this chachmat bina that they had, was setting the groundwork for what was to come. How can you be both the court Jew, right? The very last verse said that Daniel was there. In other words, he served in the king's court through the first year of Koresh, the Persian. Okay. He lasted through the entire time of Nebuchadnezzar, through the entire time of Nebuchadnezzar's descendants, who were also kings, through Dariush the Mede, and somebody that we're not quite sure who it was, whether it's Dariush the Persian or whether it's both Achashverosh and then Achashverosh's son Dariush and then on to Koresh. He served through many reigns of kings, maintaining his identity as a Jew. And in the end, the Sarasarisim, who thought that by giving them names of costume names, not Persian names, right? Giving them names of the costume Avodah Zarah would cause them to find favor in the eyes of everybody else. It turns out that's not what helped them find favor. If anything, it was their insistence on maintaining their identity as a Jew, not by assimilating, but by maintaining themselves. On the one hand, it caused them problems, and on the other hand, that's where a lot of their success also came from. And so it's that tension that we're going to see in the stories, etc. And some of them, they're just great stories. Anyway, Lila Tov, any other questions from anybody else? Yal, Bachmira?
No questions. I just understood right away that couldn't possibly be the end of the story, that everything was signed because Daniel found favor in Nebuchadnezzar's eyes, and he had so much Chochmah and Bina, because once you're mitasek in that setting, the nisanot are continual. I mean, it's just unending. You're constantly in situations where you're being tested, and lo pashut at all.
Yeah.
Because people, it arouses resentment, it arouses suspicion,
Right.
it raises eyebrows. People think, well, why is he so standoffish? Why does he think he's better than us? Etc. The whole thing.
Right. That's a beautiful point. Yeah. It's the hardest part to be obvious. That's why we're always behind the scenes. We try to be behind the scenes when we work in the secular world.
But it's like an incredible madrega when you can just say, well, yeah, I don't eat that, or no thanks, or whatever, whatever it is. I can't make the meeting today.
Right.
Shabbos. Whoops.
Yeah.
Right.
No.
Right.
Okay. Ciao. Bye.
Yeah. I think your point about working behind the scenes is particularly appropriate to a group of women, because women tend to have more of that aspect of working behind the scenes. It was harder for Daniel and his colleagues who had to take a public role.
Yeah.
So how do you,
Exactly, totally.
how can you be the court Jew and be behind the scenes? That's where a lot of the tension is going to show up. Okay. See y'all next week.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you